Utility Finance Oversight Committee. Item 2, could we take the roll call and determine if we have a quorum?
Chairperson Johnston,
Present?
Vice Chair Bathgate,
Present.
Member Turchek,
Present.
Member Connect, Member Johns. A quorum is present.
Thank you. Item 3, public comment. This is a time set where the public is invited to comment on and discuss any topic that is relevant to or within the authority of the Utility Finance Oversight Committee. Are there any members of the public who wish to address the committee?
Denny French, Carson City, Nevada, and it's so nice to get a chance to meet you all. It seems like there's a bit of a space between your meeting each other, and I'm hoping that that time was well spent. You all look relaxed and ready to go. So I'm just looking forward to listening to the program and learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other people present who wish to address the committee? Hearing nothing, we'll move on to item 4, possible action approval of the minutes from March 21, 2023. Mr. Connect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I move approval of the minutes from March 21, 2023.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
I thought it was going to be controversial.
No. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The minutes are approved. Item 5. This is for possible action, discussion, possible action regarding election of a chairperson and vice chairperson for the Utility Finance Oversight Committee.
Yes, for the record, Andy Hummel, Utility Manager for Carson City. This item's, as it says in the title, basically we get to have you select amongst yourselves a chair and co-chair for the year.
Thank you, Mr. Hummel. And a question, has there been a tradition, having been chair for one meeting, 1 year?
No, you get that distinction.
No, is there been a tradition of changing the chair every year? Or and
Not
vice
necessarily.
chair to move it around? I know some boards operate,
Yeah.
committees operate in that fashion.
Yeah, no, there's, I believe even in my time, there's been a few that have kept with the same.
All right, do we have any nominees or motions to nominate anyone to serve as chair of this committee for the upcoming year?
I would like to move that we retain our current chairperson for 1 more year.
I second that.
We have a motion from Jim Bathgate, a second from Cynthia Turzak. Any discussion or further nominees? And having only served 1 meeting, I would just say I would agree to serve if elected. All in favor of having myself serve? Excuse me, Mr. Connect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we make this election of yourself as chairman unanimous.
I think all in favor of the nominee?
Aye.
I make it unanimous. Thank you, Mr. Connect. Next comes the election of a vice chairperson to serve for the next year. Do we have any nominees to serve as a vice chairperson for this upcoming year.
I'd like to make a motion to retain Jim Bathgate as the vice chair for the next calendar year.
All right, we have a motion to retain Jim Bathgate from Mr. Johns, a second from Mr. Knecht. Any discussion? Any further nominees? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That is also unanimous. So we will move now to item 5B. For possible action, discussion, possible action regarding the tentative fiscal year 2025 wastewater fund budget, its compliance with adopted financial policies, and recommendation to the Board of Supervisors regarding the tentative wastewater fund budget for fiscal year 2025. Ms. Stevenson, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, Jamie Stevenson, Accounting Manager for the record. I'd like to acknowledge our fiscal analyst for Public Works, Courtney Nicholas. She helps out a lot with these budgets, and I appreciate all of her help. Up front, for all three of the utility funds, I would like to mention a few things. We have budgeted revenue that includes our scheduled rate increases for July 1st of 2024. Also, across all three funds, we've budgeted a 7.5% increase to our group medical insurance, and we have included our contractual salary increases. Our budgeted non-operating income consists mostly of investment income, and we always budget conservatively. All right, for the wastewater fund, we've budgeted to include a 3.5% increase to rates. This is the last year of that set 3.5% rate increase, and next year for fiscal year 26.
Jamie?
Huh?
Sorry, your presentation isn't showing.
Oh, it's on my computer. I don't know how to, do I do this thingy? Oh. Gotta be smarter than the technology, okay. All right, so wastewater fund, we have that 3.5% rate increase scheduled. Fiscal year 26, we're going to see those rates based on CPI, and that's all part of the approved rate schedule that the board approved in 2020. Our salaries and benefits increased $173,662 over estimated fiscal year 2024. This increase is a result of our annual contractual increases for employees. I will mention that that contractual increase, there's a 2% COLA, and then each employee gets a 3% merit on their anniversary if they've had a above expectations, meets expectations or better review. We've also included our benefit rate increases. And we've budgeted for promotions of employees that are expected to receive certifications. There's a 10% budgeted for that, for those employees. Our budgeted services and supplies decreased slightly by $13,784. There are budgeted increases to internal service charges, which are part of the citywide cost allocation plan. And we had a decrease to telemetry repair and maintenance, and that gave us our overall decrease. Capital spending plan for wastewater is $6,371,000. The larger projects that we have planned are the wastewater line rehab replacement and septic receiving and a vehicle and warehouse building. Here is a listing of our capital projects for the next 5 years.
Let's see. Mr. Connect, did you have a question? This one, and I was thinking if this is going to be brief, I was thinking we could hold questions till the end, but if it's better to, you know,
I have
if you want to go ahead, go
two
ahead.
or three on this page. Thank you for that presentation
Sure.
and the rest of it. We've got a 3.5% rate increase for wastewater and subsequently for other funds, 3% and no increase. Is the 3.5 a policy of the Board of Supervisors?
I can take that question again for the record. Andy Hummel, Utility Manager. The difference between the water and the wastewater rate increases were what was determined in that rate study that was adopted in late 2020. At the time, it was the consultant's work showed that we needed a little bit more of an increase on the wastewater fund over time than we did the water to get it to continue meeting our policies. Some of that was, at the time, the water fund was fully meeting our depreciation goals, whereas wastewater wasn't. And over this period, we've brought that to where it meets.
Okay, and the capital outlay of $6.371 million, has that been incorporated into future impact on revenues and expenses, especially in the wastewater fund?
Yes, yeah, that's part of our annual budgeting.
Okay, just a general question here. The standard approach among public bodies here and elsewhere, in my understanding, has been to essentially project what the expenses will be on some reasonable basis, like the contracts that have been signed and that sort of thing, and then compare that to the reasonably expected revenues and say, gee, how much of a rate or fee or tax increases do we need? The other approach, and by the way, the other approach is what all Carson City businesses and families do, which is to say, well, how much revenues are we going to have reasonably, and then start with their priority list and add or commit things until they've exhausted the revenues, which characterizes our wastewater fund and water and storm sewer funds.
We shoot for the first and sometimes end up at the second. Yeah. So, for example, this is a 5-year CIP in front of us. If we saw that our revenues, say when we're planning fiscal year 26, we don't receive as many connection fees, for example, or maybe on the commercial side, our usage goes down, so we're not seeing as much revenue there. Typically, we would look at that capital side first. Do we need to pull something back rather than go ask for more money?
Cool. If we didn't have a 3.5% rate increase baked into the wastewater fund, what would change in the wastewater fund budget?
We would just slowly over time see this fund less and less available for capital primarily, and then it would start eating into services, supplies, possibly even available for salary and benefits over time.
Okay, so the first thing you would change would be capital allocations. Basically, you've got a capital plan for various projects over time, and you add that up, and essentially you'd have to pick and choose which items in the capital plan you would defer or kill.
Yep, start prioritizing. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's important, Mr. Chairman, that the public understand what's behind the numbers and the results.
Absolutely, Mr. Connect. Let's see, go ahead.
I have another slide for the wastewater fund. The wastewater utility fund budget for fiscal year 2025 meets all of the city's adopted financial policy requirements. Our line graphs represent our financial goals, and the vertical bar graphs represent our projected cash balances. Industry standards for wastewater set operating reserve at 30 to 45 days of operating expenses. Our capital reserve goal is 2% of capital assets. Our system reinvestment funding goal is equal to depreciation expense. This amount tends to increase each year in general as we capitalize more projects and purchases, but I thought I would mention that now we're also seeing a slight increase for a new accounting standard where we're amortizing subscription-based assets. Our debt-to-equity ratio goal is a minimum of 50-50, and the debt service coverage ratio goal is 1.0 or above. And that completes my presentation on wastewater fund.
Do we have any questions from the committee?
So-
Mr. Knapp?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we say equity, is that essentially the contributions of the taxpayers, or excuse me, ratepayers? I get those mixed up once in a while.
I would say yes.
Okay. One small thing. On the fiscal summary for enterprise funds
Yes.
for wastewater utility, we have the 3.44% increase in revenues. That's 3.5 basically, or whatever. But when we go down to expenditures, we have varying percentages, most of them zero, negative, or de minimis, except salary and benefits go up 6.58% and 4.71% respectively. How did we arrive at that as a proposal? And was there any role in terms of what comparing it to the total revenue and especially the charges for services?
For salaries and benefits, we take, in January, we look at our actual employees and who they are and what they're currently making. And then we project their COLA for the next year and their merit increase for the next year. We put in their benefit increases, and then that's our salaries and benefits expense. Then in this fund in particular, we have some employees that will be that we plan to get promotions. So we factored that in as well. That's kind of our starting point for budgeting is salaries and benefits.
Yep. Leaving aside promotions, but focusing on COLAs and basically things that are union contract driven.
Mm-hmm.
What input does the board, do the voters and taxpayers and ratepayers have into the negotiation process that would be sure that they as stakeholders are represented, and what input assures that the public interest is considered, not just the city as an entity versus the union, but what input do we have on those two matters?
Well, all of the CBAs are approved by the board, and they are presented at the public meeting, and that is a chance for the public to come and provide their commentary. And they can also, let their board member know their feelings on the items.
We hope.
Yes.
Okay, so essentially, the key input here is through the Board of Supervisors for the public interest and for the ratepayer interest. Okay, hey, thank you.
May I ask a question?
Oh, what, I'm sorry, one more, if I may. On the next page, the financial policy compliance. I love seeing all that green. Can you distinguish for us capital reserve versus system reinvestment reserve funding? You have to remember, by the way, that I'm an economist and financial and policy analyst and all that stuff. I'm not an accountant, nor have I ever been.
Okay, well, I left my sheet of the financial policy requirements on my desk, it seems. So the capital reserve goal is, I mentioned it in my presentation.
Let me ask it real simply. Is capital reserve essentially new stuff?
It's for, yeah, basically for both of those. I mean, since our dollar amount there is the same as far as the funding we have available to meet those, it's kind of two different things that we're looking at that essentially the same thing. System reinvestment funding, one of those is what I was talking about, the difference between the water and the wastewater fund, how we were 100% on our system reinvestment or our depreciation goals, and we weren't on wastewater. When we started that rate study in 2019, it was approved in 2020, we were, I think, closer to 40% at that time. So that basically that the money that we were bringing in was enough to cover reinvestment in the system to rebuild it.
Since you mentioned depreciation, that is essentially a non-cash expense, right?
Yes.
Okay, and to determine the depreciation rates, is there some standard we use, or do we look at essentially our experience with various kinds of equipment and plant?
It is a little bit of both. I think we're allowed to go 50 years maximum. And there is, especially like pipelines, certain materials that are going to last way longer than that. But that depreciation will occur way before it's time to replace them. It depends on the asset type, whether it's a building or a piece of equipment, anticipated life by the manufacturer, things like that. I'll go into that.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. Bathgate.
Hi, so you do a decent amount of forecasting to develop these things. Is there anything over the last year that you would say was really unexpected? Anything stand out to you that, well, I kind of didn't see that coming? And what might have been the cause, or do you have to change any forecasting methods or anything like that?
Not on the wastewater fund. I didn't notice anything different than prior years. We're following the trend, and usage may have gone down a little, but I'd have to look at my notes. And
I'm sorry, what was that? What?
oh, I think usage may have decreased just slightly. Maybe just more efficient water usage.
But in general, everything's pretty much as expected. No,
Yes.
Nothing stands out. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, from an operational standpoint, our water usage was lower last year with as wet as it was. Usually that would translate to less flows to treat on the wastewater side, but those were higher just due to infiltration into the system, higher groundwater. I'll go into more detail in the update on that, but
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Ms. Sturzak?
I do have a couple questions, comments. I'm going to start with Mr. Hummel. So kind of building on Mr. Connect's comments about salaries, I know some of these comments that he had about negative numbers, that's not really in your control, like the decrease in connection fees. I mean, obviously, we know development's going down, and so people aren't connecting as much, so you guys don't have as much revenue coming in that regard. So I don't think we can rely on that as far as increased revenue. But as far as salary going up, I mean, I said it before, but I'm all for increasing salaries as much as possible because I know you guys are losing people right and left. So some of the questions I have is, how many employees do you have right now for wastewater?
Between water and wastewater, they're pretty evenly split, about 20 in each fund. Of actual employees under me. That will differ slightly from the numbers that Jamie would use on the
Okay.
budget side. Some people are paid for out of multiple funds depending on what they do. But yeah, it's about 20 on the wastewater side.
Okay, because I think what I'm going for is, how many openings do you guys actually have and how many vacancies do you have right now? And the other question I was gonna say is, how many people have you guys lost? Because, and just so you guys know, I work for the Public Utilities Commission and I work with a lot of other water companies and wastewater companies, and I hear all the time of people leaving to go to other agencies because of pay discrepancy.
Yeah.
So the fact that they have a 6.58%, which is truly only based on merit, and a 2% COLA, which is extremely low, is not something to be worried about of, you know, and I live in Carson City, so I would be more than willing to stand up in front of the Board of Supervisors and say that's embarrassing low, and we should be embarrassed that we're only giving our operators who, I appreciate you saying that the money would come from the capital improvement projects first, because if you don't have the people turning the valves in the street, what does it matter if you have a new pipe? So, the other question I had was, I'm assuming the COLA increase that was actually negotiated in the contract with the unions, that's not something you guys calculate every year?
No, that's part of the
Okay.
contract.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's, I know some people, like even for us with our agency, we have a annual calculated rate that comes through that is something that can be adjusted based on true cost of living, true effects of inflation, because unfortunately 2% does not cover what's actually going on in the world. And then I believe last year we had a conversation that there was a salary survey that was being worked on. Is that something? I know that wasn't anything that was mentioned in the paperwork, so what's the outcome of that?
They did do a study.
Okay,
They just recently received it, and
Okay.
so they're working on what to do with those
Okay.
results.
okay. And then I know this is what our findings are, is something that we give our recommendations to the Board of Supervisors. So they're going to decide what to do with it next, and I understand that you guys have done a fantastic job to keep the budgets very healthy and have great ratios. But I would strongly encourage my fellow board members that we need to encourage them to give a very strong, I don't think we can probably say a specific percentage, but just think long and hard about that survey, about giving people increases, because I know they can look at Douglas County, they've given, I think it was like an 8 or 9% increase. I work for the state, we got a very healthy increase. Other Tumwa obviously is getting way, I mean, that's not a fair comparison, but I would be more than happy to advocate in front of the Board of Supervisors, whether it's at public comment or if we have it, I don't know if the lawyer can, or he's not paying attention. If I get to speak, but I feel very strongly about this. But anyway, so I don't know if you guys are in agreement or concur or whatever, but anyways, it is just something that from what I hear from other companies and even the companies I regulate, that I know you're losing years of institutional knowledge. And since I live here in Carson City, I feel very strongly that, I wouldn't want to lose that institutional knowledge to Tumwa or Douglas County or Tahoe. I mean, Tahoe's beautiful. I understand people wanting to work up there, but anyways, that's my very strong opinion.
Mr. Johns, any questions? I have a few, following up really on Ron's points, but looking forward. And so this 3.5% increase, this is the last year of this multi-year effort to get all three of these enterprise funds on a sound financial footing, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But then going forward, there's the statement in here that the budgeted revenue includes, for fiscal year 26, rate increases will be based on the CPI. And I guess the questions I have are really, what is the wastewater group going to use to determine whether any or all of that CPI indexed amount is needed for the upcoming fiscal year? And I guess the question I have is like, we're beating some of the financial metrics. If we're above the system reinvestment funding, if we're above the capital reserve amount, what's the thought process there? Is it a matter of, well, we're just going to assume we're going to use every bit of that CPI cap that we're looking at because we have a list of funding needs to draw a comparison, for example, road maintenance in Carson City? Are we looking at something like that where we're going to need every penny of that? Or are we going to look at that and say, based on current projections, current rates, we can forego the CPI indexed rate increase, or we might only need a piece of it? So could you respond to that?
Yeah, so the rate study or the rate program that was approved after this year, so starting basically July 1, 2025, for the water, wastewater, and stormwater funds, the rates are indexed off of the CPI. It's within a range, 0% minimum, 3% max. When we did the rate study, we looked backwards. At that time, it had been like 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years since a rate increase had been done previously, and basically looked at kind of, if we had followed CPI then, where would we be? And it basically put us to where we needed to be to keep up, essentially. As far as, those goals and maybe that excess money, especially on the wastewater side, we're anticipating we're going to need plant improvements at some point. We'd really like to not borrow money if possible. So a lot of that is going into undesignated capital funds to keep building that.
And so, but as far as the debt to equity ratio,
Mm-hmm.
So, even if you're well exceeding that, the preference would be to
If we can
err on the equity side, is what we're saying here?
Yeah, if we can pay go as much of that as possible, but also puts us in a good position depending on what the state decides with our permit when it's time. If we need to really enhance our nutrient removal at the wastewater plant and go some, large dollar outputs to, go to new technologies there, that puts us in a good position to be able to borrow money if we need to for something bigger.
And I just, a comment there, I'd be a little concerned if that's built into future budgets as an automatic thing, because that seems to be an incentive to spend, and it's pay now and pay later, which I get.
Yeah.
But by the same token, it doesn't seem, it seems that should be examined each and every year to see if it's really justified based on the financial metrics. If we're exceeding the financial metrics, being conservative at the expense of the customer. I just know as a
Yeah.
Carson City customer, we've gone through a certain, and which I fully support. But it's been dramatic increases we've seen over the last 5 years. And it was to get to a place where all these entities were on solid ground. And I would hate to think that now it's a built-in increase going forward. I think you're going to see a lot of pushback from your customers if there's a perception that that's not being rigorously examined each and every year. And again, all my questions are not for this, what's before us today, but looking forward when we
Yeah.
get into the CPI indexing. For what it's worth, I had one further thought or question to you on the grant and for fiscal year 2023, 2024 estimated there was like 3 million of grant revenue. What was the source of that, Andy or Jamie?
Okay, so we have a grant for, is that the name of it? The flood protection. And then we're getting those for the Southeast Sewer Project, the omnibus funds from the federal government. And I don't, that's,
Yeah, so the flood project at the wharf was basically to purchase flood barriers and do some berming to keep, when we get into a high flow event on the creek, to prevent the site from flooding and basically not being able to access.
Okay.
And
But-
then, but as far as those sources, some of that would have been essentially money that was part of all the COVID Act stuff. Yeah.
Is
that the
there
feds
any
were pushing
money,
through.
at least for wastewater, is there any money under the bipartisan infrastructure bill? Or
We,
has that showed up yet, or is it?
yeah, we haven't got it yet,
I
no.
see Mr.
Yeah.
Schultz shaking his head. so
Yeah.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's all the questions I had. Any further questions? Ms. Terzak?
Just a comment on the CPI. I'm just double checking. That's similar to like the gross domestic product or the gross domestic product deflator, that it's calculated every single year. Like once we get to that point. So it will be, it's just literally accounting for inflation. So, I mean, it will be something that it's just going to keep up with the economy that, I mean, like this year, I think when we calculated it was like 3.4%. And so if it's going to be, like the economy only goes up, 5% or 0.5%, it's literally just keeping up with their cost. If, cost of services, cost of products or whatever. So it literally is just going to be keeping up with what their increase of cost. So I don't think it's going to be anything that they're going to be trying to gouge the customers.
I'll just, Darren Schultz, the Public Works Director, for the record. So this was talked about very, very extensively when we did the last rates study. And I'm not here to convince anybody you should be in favor of it or not. But the background really was there was a lot of frustrations that we brought a rate study to them and we needed so much money all at once to operate the utilities. And the selling point for indexing is if at the end of the rate study you hold your rates completely flat, but meanwhile the cost of business is inching up every year, and then we would come back in 5 to 7 to 8 years and say we need a 20% increase to get ourselves back up together. And that's what we did. And that's why the rates, we had the tremendous increases. And at that time, they didn't want to do that again. They wanted to slowly continue to add additional funding into it so that, we wouldn't have to come back and ask for these big, huge increases that was such a hardship on people. So that's why they decided to do it. And there was so much debate back and forth as to the practicality or whether or not it made sense. But that's really the background is just, if you keep your funding flat, but your expenses, as we know, they don't go down. And we talked about salaries, but the cost of a piece of pipe is doubled in the last 4 years. For a foot of pipe, it's doubled. Plastics, all of that stuff. And so the idea is this kind of tries to keep a somewhat of a bite out of the inflation as you go forward, so that we would avoid those big increases down the road. So that's the background. I'm not here to convince anybody the pros and cons of it.
No, and thank you, Mr. Schultz. That's, no, I guess, and I guess my thought is, though, that we have financial metrics. And so if you're exceeding the financial metrics, it just seems to me there needs to be a new look every time you consider a rate increase. And because cost inputs don't all go up at the CPI. And there's probably 20 different CPIs. I don't know which one we're talking about here. But so that's my only comment on it. And again, that was forward-looking, not for what's before us today.
May I?
Mr. Bathgate?
So what Mr. Schultz just said there, that was perfectly reasonable. I think the strange part is the linking it to the consumer price index. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, that's what they track, the prices of what the typical urban family of 4 consumes in a typical year. Where you talk about pipe, I mean, that it seems some other measure other than the consumer price index would have been a better choice.
Yeah. And a lot of our, what we're using on that, we are using CPI, it's Consumer Price Index for the rates. Our connection fees are tied to the Engineering News and Review Construction Cost Index. Same limits, 0% minimum, 3% maximum. And those two do kind of go different directions, depending on the year. This last year, we've been using that on the connection fees for 10 years now. This last year was 2.58% on that index.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as mentioned, the GDP price deflator would even be a better choice, or the producer price index, something like that. But
Well, as Mr. Connect knows, we have our own batch of economists that do their own voodoo magic to come up with a GDP deflator every year, and just poofs comes out. And
Yeah. We looked at numerous ones, or our consultant did at the time, as to kind of what maybe made the most sense. And that's where we landed, something that was easily findable by the public, as well as kind of kept up.
thank you.
But I was just going to say, I do know it was the same thing. We actually have some water companies that have waited as long as 20 years between rate cases, and maybe as low as like 10 years. And yeah, it's the same thing. Like their rates go up so much. And once they started doing the annual GDP deflator, it helps just creep up the rates enough that it's not such a shock in between. So that's why we do it as well. So.
Mr. Connect?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have, since we're on this subject, I have 3 fundamental points I want to make. I was going to hold them to the end, but in the interest of sort of wrapping this up, if it's okay by you all.
No, as long as we're not going to hear them at the end as well, right?
As long as what?
As long as we won't hear them again at the end.
You won't hear them again at the end?
Go ahead, Mr.
Okay. First of all, this isn't one of the points, but in the area of full disclosure, I used to be an employee of the State Public Utilities Commission. And before that, the PUC in California and the Energy Commission there. And I've done a lot of consulting work to such bodies around the country. One of the benefits of a background in economics, finance, public policy, and no background in accounting, but a lot of supervision of accountants, is you get to see some other perspectives. And the first one is this. The inflation indexes are not the appropriate metric to use. Let me give you two very fundamental examples. 100 years ago, the percentage of the family budget in this country that went to food and food services was 25%. That's a huge chunk of your income, but it's a measure of what people had to spend for the most fundamental necessity. Today, it's 10% or less. Actually, it may have wafted up with some of the increases people were talking about to 11%, but basically, it has come down hugely. If food and such had been increasing at the inflation rate, it would still be 25%. The essence is we have technological progress in private sectors, such as food, communications, automobiles, everything. And so indeed, in a good economy, in a good sector, a well-functioning one, the prices don't go up at the inflation rate. They go up slower, thanks to human ingenuity and technological progress. So that, by the way, the other example is a 3-minute phone call 100 years ago from San Francisco to New York cost you 2 weeks' wages. Today, you may not even pay anything for it. It may be built into your plan. And you don't have to make it trunk to trunk like you had to then. You can make it from out in the Nevada desert to wherever. So the problem, of course, with the public sector is that it has not generally reaped the benefits of technological progress the way other sectors have. Which brings us to the second point. There is a substantial body of empirical literature over the last 30 years, starting with Robert Barrow at Harvard, who asked the question, what is the optimal fraction of the income, the national income that should go into the public sector? And over 4 annual controller reports, I pointed out that, and I had a study done by the University of Nevada Econ Department, and they came back, surveyed all that literature, and said, well, it's about 17 to 26%. And I have a graph in the 4 controllers reports, annual reports I wrote, that shows we haven't been down to 26% since the Eisenhower administration. And we've continued, I'll do it from your side, we've continued to go up, okay? And it's gone up precipitously in this century and especially in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And so what this does, it slows economic growth. It slows the benefits of technological progress, et cetera. And people are not worse off than their parents, but they are worse off than they would have been with an optimal policy. We've had 250 years of great growth after eons of no growth. And the reason has been because of good policies, including limiting the reach, the size, the scope of the public sector. So we should not be looking at growing the public sector. We should be looking to rein in the size, scope, and reach of it. Final point, there's a huge body for 50 years and more of public choice literature, especially empirical stuff, that shows that essentially the decision makers, legislatures, governors, Congress, presidents, even supervisors and mayors, my gosh, are captured effectively through the political process by especially by special interests in general, and this includes crony capitalists, et cetera, but it also includes the public employee unions. And so I've worked half my life in the public sector. There's no animosity here. But the point is that you can't make a good case that public employees in general, at all levels, state, local, and federal, are underpaid. They are systematically, generally paid as well or better than the private sector. And in fact, I looked at that in one of the controller's reports and found that in Nevada, the deal is the public sector employees are paid roughly at and this, by the way, excludes Clark and that other county to the north, Washoe. The public sector employees are paid roughly at the rate of the private sector, with a couple of differences. One, they start out higher and then they don't end up as high at the end. So, top management positions, believe it or not, are underpaid. Second thing about that is that some technical areas are very much underpaid compared to the private sector. So I say all that to let you understand how it is I approach this and why I ask the questions I do and what I think. And as a public servant myself, I've been involved for many years in trying to make sure that the public interest, which is basically maximizing growth and fairness, and market systems do that, that's what's represented. And it doesn't come down to big gaming and the legislature and governor. It doesn't come down to public employee unions and the Board of Supervisors. The only place we have that problem is in Washoe and Clark counties here in Nevada. But I'm always very aware of these issues and very attuned to try to help them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connect. And let's see, I think, any further questions from the committee members? Okay. Do we have this is an action item here. Find it in my scribbles on this page.
I can find it on mine.
Hey,
Mr.
do we
Chairman,
have, go ahead, do we have a motion here to,
I move to acknowledge that the tentative wastewater fund budget for FY25 is in compliance with the adopted financial policies and to recommend that the Board of Supervisors approve the tentative wastewater budget or fund budget for FY25. Thank you to the staff for crafting that.
do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Mr. Bathgate. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? The recommendation to the Board of Supervisors is approved regarding the tentative wastewater fund budget for fiscal year 2025. Moving on to item 5C, discussion and possible action regarding the tentative fiscal year 2025 water fund budget, its compliance with adopted financial policies, and a recommendation of the Board of Supervisors regarding the tentative water fund budget for fiscal year 2025. Ms. Stevenson?
Okay, Jamie Stevenson, Accounting Manager for the record. For the water fund, we have budgeted a scheduled 3% rate increase to revenues. That will be the last year of our set rate increases. And then for this fund as well, for fiscal year '26, those rates will be based on the CPI. Salaries and benefits increased $194,413 over estimated fiscal year 2024. Those increases include our contractual salary increases and our anticipated benefit rate increases. It's same for this fund as it was for wastewater, with the 2% and the 3% merit. We've also have budgeted for promotions of employees who are anticipated to achieve certifications. Our services and supplies decreased $55,488 over estimated fiscal year '24. Overall, that decrease is because of decreases to internal service charges. Capital spending for fiscal year 2024 is $3,535,000. The larger projects we have planned are the continuation of the Quill treatment plant and the water line replacement and rehab. Here you have a list of our planned 5-year capital projects. And for our financial policies, the 2025 Water Fund budget meets all of the city's adopted financial policy requirements. The spike you see in the green capital reserve bar in fiscal year 2022 represents the increase in cash due to the receipt of bond monies for the Quill treatment plant in 2022. In fiscal year 2023, that project began, but the bulk of the spending was still ongoing into 2024. So you still see those large reserves in fiscal year '23. Industry standards for the water fund operating reserve is 60 to 90 days minimum of operating expenses. Are there any questions on the water fund?
Questions from the committee? Go, Mr. Bathgate.
What is an example of the internal service charges?
Those are the citywide cost allocation plan, where we have a third-party consultant review what the departments of the city use for city services from the general fund, like the finance department, the HR department, IT, the treasurer's office who collects all the cash and cash receipts. And then they allocate those expenses to the departments accordingly.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Ms. Jurzak?
So I think I started asking the question about how many people that you've lost and what amount of vacancies you have right now, and then I never let you finish.
Yeah, and my answer covers both the water and wastewater fund.
Okay.
So good thing. Of the roughly 40, I think it's 41 employees across the two funds that I have under me. Since basically June of last year, it's been about 25% that we've turned over. 11 employees that have turned over, whether some of those, sure everybody remembers, there used to be 2 of me, Eddie Quaglieri, our water utility manager, kind of started that, I guess, but left for Tumwa in July of last year. We lost 3 other staff members to Tumwa. Basically, they built a whole new water crew, and we just happened to be the one that
Stopped them.
our people saw more money and went. So there was some of that was lost to outside agencies, and then some was like one of our environmental control officers is now the supervisor at the landfill. But we had to backfill that, and that position came out of our meter group. Our meter group is 4 employees, a senior meter tech and 3 meter technicians. All 3 of those junior technicians are new, which has created a lot of fun in getting them trained and up to speed, things like that. As far as vacancy rate, I'm happy to say right now we're at 1 that we're trying to hire. And it's been a that position has been open for 2 months and hard to get somebody to apply.
So as far as brand new, fresh to water operating, wastewater operating, how many people do you have right now that are just brand spanking new or?
Of that, probably about half of that 25%.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is one of the issues, especially that crew that Tumwa basically built. That was some of our seniored, people that you lose and you can't really go out and hire a replacement at that level. It's building up.
Right. And then of that 25% that left, some of those were retirees too, that was, or is that on top of, and then retirees on top of that?
No retirees
Oh, okay.
this last year, yep.
Okay. So I guess the question I had, which I maybe should have clarified before the wastewater, and I know we might have a little bit of disagreement, and that's why we vote. So when we're proposing recommendations to the Board of Supervisor, can we add a little caveat that or are they gonna read our minutes of how we feel about?
Stay up all night.
Oh, okay. I thought they were just
Yeah.
gonna watch us right now. And how does that work?
So Adam Tully, Deputy District Attorney, the main thing is to stay within the scope of the agenda title.
Okay.
So as long as what your motion can't add something that's not encompassed by the agenda title, otherwise
Okay.
we run into open meeting law issues.
Okay, well, we don't want to do that. Okay, so we only can recommend or approval or denial, not, hey, so they could only read the minutes or watch and that's it. Okay, just curious.
Yeah,
Further questions?
When the time comes for a proposed motion, if you've got something in mind, it might be easier to flesh it out with something more concrete, but
Okay,
generally, we should be focused on the tentative FY25 budgets and compliance with adopted policies.
okay. Or is it just better to make a public comment at the Board of Supervisor meeting and say?
I won't say better, but you can definitely do that.
Well, I just didn't know what the proper forum would be, but you're saying during
That-
the proposed motion?
That would be a so public comment at a Board of Supervisors meeting would be a proper forum, and whether here is or not, I guess would depend on the particular motion.
Okay. Well, that's why I didn't know if during a motion it would be even allowed to add, consider it for the Board of Supervisor Board of Supervisors to ensure that they specifically consider. Yeah. So, anyways, but I guess I got my answer that we're only allowed to.
Yeah, I guess unless you can pin it to an existing adopted financial policy, it might be hard to fit it into the scope of the existing
Okay.
agenda title.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Knack?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleague to your left, being a good economist and policy analyst, hits on the key thing here, the internal services charge. Some of them are lower, some of them are higher in today's presentation. Let me just provide a little bit of background on that. Many decades ago, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power made internal services charge a big deal because what they were doing, what their city council did and mayor, was say, gosh, we don't want to increase taxes. That just doesn't help us politically. It doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good. So here's what we'll do. We'll go in and increase these internal services charge that the public utilities pay or collect, pay to the general fund, essentially. And that way we won't have to increase taxes. and the voters won't be screaming at us. They'll have to go to the utility board, and maybe to the Utility Finance Advisory Commission, and make their comments and make their complaints there. And so for a long time, LADWP set the standard for excessive internal services charges, and other public agencies and enterprise funds did the same thing. So when my friend the mayor and a few other people start going into this, there's some background for you as to what's really going on, what their real concern is. My question is, who and how sets the various internal services charges that we apply to our water, sewer, and storm sewer utilities? How do we be sure that it's a really accurate, good measure of what the cost is and what the value is that's provided to the utility enterprises, and not end up with what Mayor Bagwell talked about one time, where I think there was a sewer that was built, and it was charged to, I think it was snow clearance, because the trucks, with the plows had to use that road too. So eventually that was corrected, but how do we set these charges?
There is a consultant. She's a neutral party, and she meets with the departments, and I haven't sat in on it, but I know she asks many, many questions and sits with them for quite a while to come up with what they're using, and she does a big analysis to determine what the charges should be for each department.
I think it would be useful in the future. This seems very arcane and esoteric and makes my eyes glaze over. I think it would be useful to raise the visibility of this process and the resulting recommended rates, and to let people understand why it's such an issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hi. Pam Ganger, Deputy CFO. If I could just add a comment about the internal service charges. The cost allocation study is done annually by a third-party consultant and is vetted through the Board of Supervisors meetings. So it is presented there in completion. It's based on hours worked by the various individuals and various departments for the departments that are being charged. I hope that adds a little clarity.
That's very helpful. I'm just saying, I've done a number of cost allocation studies and marginal cost studies in my life in the utility business, and it's about the same as here. I think it would be useful, by the way, the essence to cost allocation studies is, if you mess with it, you can get whatever results you want or your client wants. But it would be useful to highlight the nature of this interest for the public and for the press. Thank you.
Any further questions from the committee regarding the tentative water fund budget? Mr. Bathgate.
Thank you. Forgive me for what is probably a foolish question, but on page 39, the personnel detail worksheet, can you explain what number of positions of an example, let's say 0.15 represents the asset services manager? How does that work?
So yeah, like that one For example, at 0.125, as you pointed, or 0.15, as you pointed out. So the asset services manager is essentially the heads up our GIS group and tracks our assets. That's something that's not just a water or wastewater usage. It's every one of our groups uses that at some level.
Okay, so
they're
it's
gonna get-
sort of across?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. That's,
Yep.
I was just curious
Yeah,
about that.
yeah, they're spread across the funds that use them.
Got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
I had one question on the Quill water treatment plant. What's the estimated completion date on that?
I have that in my update if you wanna, if we wanna go into it then. We're looking at going out to bid here in the next 2 months. And with construction, the bulk of it starting after this summer's peak usage period for completion next summer, summer of '25.
Thank you. Any final questions? All right. Do we have a motion on this with respect to the water fund? Tentative budget for fiscal year 2025? Mr. Connect.
I'll do it because I have a proposed motion in front of me. I move to acknowledge that the tentative wastewater fund budget, the tentative water fund budget for FY '25 is in compliance with the adopted financial policies, and to recommend that the Board of Supervisors approve the tentative water fund budget for FY '25.
Do we have a second?
Second?
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? All right, the motion is approved. Item 5D on the agenda, discussion and possible action regarding the tentative fiscal year 2025 stormwater utility fund budget, its compliance with adopted financial policies, and a recommendation of the Board of Supervisors regarding the tentative stormwater utility fund budget for fiscal year 2025. Ms. Stevenson?
Jamie Stevenson, Accounting Manager for the record. Finally, we have the Stormwater Utility Fund. For operating revenues, the monthly rate for most payers will remain the same. We'll have a change to very large properties. They will have their monthly rate increase from $180 a month to $240 a month. This is part of the approved rate increase plan that went into effect on July 1st of 2021 from the rate study that was done in 2020. For this fund as well, in fiscal year '26, we will begin increasing rates based on CPI. Our salaries and benefits increased $77,981 over estimated fiscal year 2024. Those increases can be attributed to our annual contractual employee salary increases and our expected increases to benefits. We've also budgeted an increase for promotions in this fund as well. Also, a difference that we had is in fiscal year '24 budget. There was an approved stormwater technician to start January 1st of 2024. So in fiscal year 2024, only half of that position is budgeted, whereas in 2025, the full year of that position is budgeted. Our services and supplies are budgeted to decrease $67,217 from estimated fiscal year 2024, and that is a result of lower internal service charges and professional services. Capital projects we have planned for fiscal year '25 is $1,614,000. Our big projects there are the William Street project and citywide minor improvements. Here you have a list of our 5-year planned capital projects. And for our financial policies, the Stormwater Utility Fund budget for 2025 meets all the city's adopted financial policy requirements. Industry standards for operating reserve for this fund is 45 days minimum of operating expenses. Are there any questions on Stormwater Fund?
Questions from the committee? Mr. Connect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Simple question. We have in the financial policy compliance here on this fund, the second red figure. In your professional opinions, is either of the red figures problematic, or is it just a matter of fact we missed by a small amount? And, well, actually, the one was in FY '23. So we're back in the green. Can you just comment on whether there's a problem anywhere there with the red figures?
So the system reinvestment funding goal is based on our depreciation. That's our goal. And for fiscal year 2023, depreciation was higher than I expected, only because they finished a bigger project that I was not anticipating when I budgeted my numbers. And that project was complete, and that pushed us up more than we had planned. So I don't believe there is really an issue. It was just that, yeah, my goal, I didn't set us up
I agree
properly.
with you. By the way, it's really impressive how often you meet and exceed and have a green figure. Final question, since Mr. Chairman didn't ask it on the last one, is on all three of our funds, he had previously asked about explanations of significant changes in the past and anticipated significant changes in the future. Can you summarize for broad public understanding the 1, 2, or 3 changes that we've faced unexpectedly and what we did about it, and the 1, 2, or 3 changes we expect in the future that will take something from 700,000 to 3 million?
I can start there. On the Stormwater Fund, especially, we, with our 2020 rate study, changed how we, basically our billing groups, how we bill that fund. And then for the fun of it, we threw in a completely new billing software system to implement in the middle of that. Some of that, we had an audit last year and found a couple of things to go look at. On the Stormwater Fund was basically make sure that we're charging the appropriate user charge to all the different customers. If we have a customer that's only charged one, figure out why is that appropriate or not. That we did a lot of internal work on that and cleaned up a couple hundred accounts. And then we also have a third party looking at that. They're also, some of our stormwater billing for the commercial side is based on impervious area. So since it's been a couple of years since they last did that work, we're going back and anything new, making sure it's right in the system. Yeah, unfortunately. The other big one on the Stormwater Fund, and this comes back to some of Member Turzik's comments earlier, with vacancies. This has been a hard one to have our, as well with our leadership in that group. Our Stormwater Program Manager left us in January for Tahoe, but she lives there, so it made sense after a year of driving down with the winter we had last winter, to be able to work from, a block away. It's a hard argument for us to make, but that's been another one that's been really hard to replace, that we're still open on that position.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
See, I had a couple of questions here. So that was a rate design. I see that revenue is projected to be higher, even though there's not expected to be a rate increase for 24, 25. Is that just increase in customers, or is that the rate design aspect you were talking about, where for large customers, you're going to charge more?
That is mostly because a lot of those little hiccups we had in the billing software have gotten worked out, and we've, now we're appropriately collecting the revenues.
Let's see, the other question was on planned capital expenditures for west drainage improvements for fiscal year 26 and fiscal year 27, which is like 9.3 billion and 10, billion.
Yeah.
Reading the press here about national budgets. 9.3 million and then 10 million for those 2 years, which looks like it'd be like 61% of the total 5-year spend. What are those look like huge projects. What's that all about?
Yeah, those are huge projects, and likely next year you'll see that shift out again. Those will, when it's time to build those, we will need to bond for that to be able to afford those. A lot of basically channel and piping improvements on the west end.
And just
And we're also pursuing grant funding for that side as well to hopefully bring that down.
And that was my next question, if there were grants available. But, and physically, where would these be? Would these be like detention basins, or are we talking in the streets on the west side?
It's a mix, yeah, of some pipe in the street and some enhanced detention, things like that.
And so how would that, because you have I see there's, what's the dividing line between citywide small stormwater improvements and then these west drainage improvements? Is it?
Yeah, so the citywide small is, as we get into the year, hey, we got some, plug storm drain, we need to go replace some catch basins, things like that. Some minor improvements that we can do within the year to help an area out, something smaller. If it's a bigger, engineered project, then that's when we'd see it as a individual line item.
So those big, the west drainage improvements, you're talking about putting new, bigger diameter pipe in the ground, basically on the.
Exactly. Yep.
That's all I had. Any further questions? Right. Do we have a motion on the Stormwater Utility Fund tentative fiscal year 2025 budget?
Mr. Chairman, I move to acknowledge that the tentative Stormwater Utility Fund budget for fiscal year 2025 is in compliance with the adopted financial policies, and to recommend that the Board of Supervisors approve the tentative Stormwater Utility Fund budget for fiscal year 2025.
Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right. The motion is approved. Item 5E on the agenda, discussion and presentation concerning personnel, projects, and planning related to Carson City utilities.
Good, it worked. Thank you. Again, for the record, Andy Hummel, Utility Manager for Carson City. And this is our kind of annual update on what we've been up to in the water, wastewater, and stormwater programs. Kind of the big one, I wanted to start off on the personnel side. It's been a year of changes. As I alluded to earlier, in July this last year, Eddie Quaglieri, our water utility manager left us for maybe not greener, but wetter pastures to the north with Tumwa. And at that time, we kind of looked at, what options, or Darren kind of looked at what options he had to keep everything moving. There were some other changes occurring. Our Deputy Public Works Director had recently left at that time as well for the private sector. So there was a lot of reorganization and shifting around. So at that time, I was also over our basically facilities management or maintenance group. So we shifted that out to a new central services division, and then all of the utility came under me. So. And then also wanted to mention in the room, he was pretty new last year at this time as our water operations supervisor, but Joe Reyna is here with us today. Came in on he's supposed to be off this week, but he couldn't stay away, so that'll teach him for next year maybe. And then kind of wanted to talk, it's been, if you'd asked me in February, we might have been just a touch nervous about what our water outlook was for the year, but March came in and lived up to its name. We're at essentially 100% or greater at this point on our snowpack. All those green sites there are largely what feeds into the Carson River. That one red site at the bottom is actually just missing gauge data that it doesn't say, so we don't know what it is, but have to assume that it's at least a green, given everything else. And then last year we had showed the drought outlook, and even at the time when we pulled that data last year, there was still a lot of yellow and brown color on that drought outlook chart, as we hadn't had the big storms in March of last year yet. So this was, as of a couple weeks ago, you can see we're pretty much looking at very much improved on our drought outlook. And then continuing on, water demands and system trends there for calendar 23. Saw a peak day last summer, 18.6 million gallons a day that we produced. Capacity is about 26 million gallons a day. Our average winter production, we've been looking about 4.6 million gallons a day. Joe's been looking at those numbers quite a bit over the last probably 2 months as we get close to starting Quill. When we take that plant down, we're going to lose that source. So he's been really looking at the numbers, what we're going to have to produce for the next year once that plant's not there. So any detailed questions, he can probably rattle them off in his sleep. Water loss for last year was right about 9%. The last 5-year average was a touch over 7%. So water operators tell me that's largely when we get a really wet year, we'll see more breaks, especially small services and things like that. Basically that upper couple feet of soil gets wet and things start consolidating a little bit, and we see older services start breaking. And just from how busy the crews have been, that's definitely held true this last year. And then onto the wastewater side, last year at this time when we met, showed our average daily flow up to this point for 2023 was that first 3 months of the year, we were over 6 million gallons a day of wastewater flow just due to those heavy storms that we had had. For the year, we ended up 5.63 million gallons a day. That, from a facility planning standpoint, our permit is we're allowed up to 6.9 million gallons a day average flow. Once we hit 85% of that, or about 5.85 million gallons a day, we have to start planning for what are we going to do next. We've talked with NDEP about that, got close. We're really not on their radar at this time, but we're anticipating that sooner rather than later we probably will be. In the past, we've talked about kind of our planning, what we look at from a population growth standpoint, about 0.7% to 1% a year. Our last big wet year was in 2017. projected that just to kind of check, and those wet years, it was right at 0.7% between those, over those years, so it seems like that's kind of holding true. Some project updates. On the well side, we rehabbed a couple of wells this last winter. Basically new drop pipe in one of them and motor replacements on another to get the production back up to where it should be. Did a lot of work on Eagle Station. We did a sanitary sewer rehab project there, but also did some water system improvements. Added some check valves instead of a PRV separations. Water would flow into that zone but not out, as if we saw the pressures dropping in that one, it would automatically back it up. Replace some PRV equipment on our timberline zone up in that area. A project we just went out to bid and awarded are at the wastewater treatment plant, our dewatering building. The second floor slab of that has started to delaminate in certain areas. That contractor's taken a look at it, has some ideas on how to better do that. And we're waiting to hear back from them on kind of final proposal, but it's looking like we'll be able to do that project a little easier than we hoped. We're finishing up design on a warehouse building and vehicle storage at the treatment plant. We also last summer kind of prepped for, and then over this last winter, replaced a bunch of our air vac valves on our effluent main line. That's the two bottom pictures, kind of the pre-picture on the right and the replaced picture on the left. Those have been in place since mid-'80s, late 80s when that line was built. And as big as that line is, if we get any air in there, that could be a pretty big issue. Some of those have been turned off over the years just because they were leaking and no real way to repair them while it was live. So would occasionally open them up, that kind of thing. So that definitely helped our reliability of that system. As one could expect, did just a lot of stormwater cleanup, our own crews over this last year, cleaning out ditches and things like that from debris that came down with all the rain we had. We mentioned on several of the funds, William Street, that project is nearing completion on design to go out to construction. So be some water, wastewater, and stormwater improvements in that corridor as they do that project. Our tank rehab program, we're looking at this tank, this tan staffel tank is in kind of the northern area of town. That one will be rehabbed this fall once we're past the peak demand. And then last but not least, our Quill water treatment plant. I'll have further, more bigger update on that as we go along here. Any questions on those or anything so far? And then from the kind of more planning side, we've had a lot of plans that were updated over this last year. Our water conservation plan is one that gets updated every 5 years. Eddie left me that one on the way out the door, so that was a good learning experience as I went through that. We've finalized our database and getting ready to launch our dashboard on that. For our laterals, basically our service lines to the residences and what material type those are to meet the new revised lead and copper rule. That work is due October 2024, so we're happy to get that ready to go. Our source water protection plan was updated this last year. That's usually an NDEP-led effort. They provide the funding and the consultant and then rotate through the agencies to update that. It's historically that would have been called a wellhead protection plan, but then over time they figured out that it's more than just that area around that wellhead, your creeks and streams and things like that that feed into the groundwater system or are part of that. So we got that updated. That's also available on our website, as is the water conservation plan if anyone's interested. Our water resources plan, we're looking into update that in this coming year, basically water rights and what other sources may be needed into the future, just take a new look at that, refresh that. Our wastewater plant, the facility master plan, we're out to RFQ. We received 4 submittals on that to basically start looking at as we look towards build out, as well as tightening regulations on treatment standards, what we would potentially have to be there. And then going to the Board of Supervisors in 2 weeks, our southeast or our Carson City area drainage master plan, that's on the board there. So. And then to talk a little more about Quill, as with everything over the last several years, costs have went up for sure. We were at the 30% level and even 15% level as the project was conceived at about $12 million was the budget. As we got to the 90% level late last fall, we were closer to, if not over, 20 million to do that project. So looked at, what options do we have? Do we need that full plant at this point? Is there any opportunities we can take? One of the things that's also occurring in the background, the state manages the Marlette and Hobart water system. They're getting ready to take the Marlette Dam down and rebuild that. Once that happens, it's going to be an extended period, could be 7 to 10 years until that lake is full enough that we'd be able to get that specific water back out. So looking at that, the opportunity kind of presented itself as, well, we don't necessarily need that full treatment at this time. So what would it look like if we removed essentially 1/3 of that treatment capacity for now and built everything so the components could be put in when we're ready? And so that basically largely is one set of the UV filters and the one filter train, kind of both of those crossed out in red there. The piping itself would be built, but those components wouldn't be purchased and put in at this time. And then we also looked at available funding. As you saw in the budget, there was additional capital funding put into the CIP for Quill. That was between that and reducing that, we feel we're at a point where we can comfortably go out to bid and pursue that project. Jamie talked about rates a lot as we went through her slides. Just kind of a quick refresher. We've talked numerous times, but the utility rate study we completed in 2020, the big one, our final programmed increase under that rate for the various funds is July 1st of this year, 2024. And then per code would be adjusted by the previous calendar year CPI starting on July 1st, 2025 and subsequent years thereafter. And then the water and wastewater connection fees adjust by the engineering news and review CCI. And I also mentioned a little bit earlier, the utility billing audit. This was an audit of all the basically cash collection programs within the city and what came back as far as the utility fund side, review unbilled accounts, ensure accounts receiving appropriate charges, and review policies. That audit was completed mid last year. Like I said, we did an internal review on all the accounts, and we have a third party looking at them right now to confirm those. Last year, we started showing this kind of pennies on the dollar. Should probably just do this as 3 slides in the future. It's pretty small wording, but water is on the upper left, wastewater in the middle, and then stormwater on the bottom. And I think kind of one big thing, all 3 of those funds, the employee benefits and salaries, are all in the 12 to 14% range. Tumwa's, they haven't published a new one for this year, but last year they were about 10% higher on those. So they make that up. Our capital investment is a little bit higher in exchange. And with that, that's my update. Any questions?
Nick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the whole staff. One quick comment about turnover issues. Shortly after the fall of Rome, when I got my degree and switched from math and physics to engineering and economics, I worked as assistant city engineer back in Urbana, Illinois. And in that experience, in the legislature, in my various consulting work, and as a regent and controller, I always heard a lot about problems of turnover and short staffing in the public sector. I never saw any empirical evidence of it. The loss of a person is a typical problem, but it's also an anecdote. It's not data. So my impression, my firm belief from a lot of experience is that the public sector does not have as much turnover as the private sector, and that it would benefit from more turnover. Secondly, on that, Tumwa raids us, and the other universities raid our universities, et cetera, but we also raid them. And the proof in the pudding of all this is that long-term, not short-term, but long-term, the career in the public sector is typically longer for a person, for an employee, than it is at one venue in the private sector. So I'm not too concerned about that. My final comment here is the staff, the management staff here today has done an excellent job of answering our questions and concerns and presenting the details and the facts and the numbers, and God bless you for it. And that's sort of reflective of my view that the staff in the utilities section does an excellent job, and please continue, and I look forward to seeing you again next meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions? Mr. Bathgate?
Just a comment. Thank you for the clarity of the presentation. Fantastic. Greatly appreciate it.
I had a question about a quill. If further grant funding came in, could you go back to the original design, or is that off the boards at this point?
We would have to change order those components back in, but yeah, or if it came in, trends reverse themselves and we catch the wave just right and the bids come in cheaper, then yeah, we would look to possibly add some of that back in.
And with respect to the Marlet Lake Hobart system, was that 7 years to get water back to what's needed? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that reservoir has to basically fill up before we get the top 3 feet of it is what's usable. So it has to get there before we can take water out. We do still get water out of that system from other springs and such, but that specific water in Marlette, we'd be without that for a number of years.
I wasn't aware. Are they going to drain Marlet?
Yeah, to be able to rebuild the dam, that's the plan. Yep.
Wasn't aware of that.
Do you know when they plan on starting that project?
Their plan was this summer. Now, whether that continues or if they run into permitting issues, we'll see, but yeah.
Just another side note, I noticed you guys had a line item for purchasing $50,000 worth of acre feet of water rights. When you guys purchase water rights, what is that used towards?
That's kind of as an opportunity presents itself. Yeah. Yeah, we're not actively going out and looking for it, but if somebody does have something, it gives us that ability to at least get started.
Any further questions for Mr. Hummel? Thank you. Moving on to item 6 on the agenda, non-action items. Future agenda items, status reports, and comments from staff or members of the committee. Any comments or suggestions for future agenda items? Hearing none, we'll move on to item 7, public comment. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the committee?
Thank you, Chair. Jenny French, Carson City, Nevada. I appreciate the presentations that were given today very much, and I appreciate the discussion by the committee. I would like you all to put on your agenda that I'd like you to have meetings more often because I think your input is so valid and so valuable. And the exchange of communications between altering views here today, I found myself in a position where I'm going, I worked in a city that I loved in California. It was Carpinteria. I worked for nearly 10 years. I would have worked there for pennies on the dollar if I could afford to have lived there. I had to live out of that town and live in another so that I could work in the area that I did. And it was well worth my trip. So I'm not real worried that people aren't getting paid enough, and that's why they leave, because it was mentioned some left for greener pastures and some left for wetter pastures. Their reasons for leaving were multiple and happen. It happened a lot lately. I also would like to bring up the fact that the centrifuge are very expensive, and we're looking at a time when those are going to need to be updated, upgraded, and higher tech. Cut down some of the vibration. But with what they're developing now and what they've paid for now, it's sort of a fail to me. I think the equipment's going to fail. It's already failed because of its aging out, not so much that it stopped, but it needed to be rebuilt, and it costs a lot to get it rebuilt because you couldn't do it at the site, had to ship it. The structure they're putting underneath is to accommodate just the slab, not redesign the actual second story. Perhaps that's in the work and I haven't talked about it, so I'm sorry I'm not up to date on that. But some of those things that were considered emergencies or considerations that were outside of the box, I think should have been foreseen. And I think that the Marlette situation is going to be very interesting to see us maneuver through. And while this was all based on mostly water utility and such, I just have learned so much and have more questions than I came in with originally. So I want to thank everybody, but I really want to impress on the people here today that I am maybe the only public here. And while I don't speak for any one group, I do know that when you raise your rates and you raise your taxes, we can't keep this community going as vibrantly as we could if we had certain percentages of our taxes, of our utility costs in line with the reality of our expenses as individuals here. And I think that would relate to the people that are employees as well, of course, and the fact that they might want to look for more money somewhere else. But I don't think you're going to find more beautiful location to work in or with as nice and as special and amazingly able people that they're working for now. So I hope the retention thing is raised without necessarily having to raise their salaries. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any further members of the public who wish to address the committee at this time? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 8. We have a motion to adjourn. I think that's a motion from Mr. Connect. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, and hearing no opposed? All right, the motion carries, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.